What up, Pittsburgh Steelers fans? It's Matty Peverell here with another Steelers War Room on the Steelers Touchdown Under Network. Proud to bring you this show looking at all things. Do the Steelers have enough depth at the center position? We know that Mason Cole is there as the starter. People have talked about the fact about whether he has injury issues. The Steelers have four players that we're going to talk about today outside of Mason Cole, and they are Spencer Anderson, their 7th round draft pick. We're going to talk a little bit about James Daniels. We're going to talk a little bit about Ryan McCollum, and we're going to talk about the very controversial Kendrick Green. You can also find us on Anchor, Spotify, and Apple podcasts as well. And that is available at Steelers TDU if you just search there. All right, let's crack into it. I said this: do the Steelers have enough depth at center? Who are the four questions? Let's go through it one by one. But what I wanted to first do is quickly bring up what does the Steelers' depth chart potentially look like right now? Equally, who are their offensive linemen? Now, for some Steelers fans, you may not have been across it since the season finished, so you may not realize who they've brought in, who they haven't, where are those guys lining up. So obviously, we're not really talking about any of the guys at tackle. The guy read on the screen that's red on the screen, Dylan Cook, he was a pickup that I don't expect to make the 53. Kendrick Green's in orange in our color coding system with the depth chart shows we do, because he is either going to make the practice squad in my mind, or perhaps he could be depth. We'll talk about that on this show. Or he could be cut. Spencer Anderson's going to be there, whether it's on the squad or the practice squad, and Ryan McCollum is probably going to be on the practice squad. But those were highlights that Mark and I gave before I did some of this background into looking at the center position, where it's a little bit like inside linebacker. There's options, but you don't love the depth there. But we're going to go through that. So just want to give the state of play. Now, James Daniels obviously has played a little bit of center too, so we're going to cover him off. And as I said, we're not going to talk about Mason Cole. He's slotting in there as the starting center. What I'm concerned about is he healthy? Can he stay healthy? And if not, what are they going to do, particularly in allowing Kenny Pickett to get clean snaps at the football? We saw at the end of Pouncey's career, and as Ben got older as well, some of the challenges that existed there, particularly in Pouncey's last year. Everyone remembers that awful playoff game against the Cleveland Browns. So you can never take the center position for granted. Okay, so we're going to first talk about Kendrick Green. And look at what options he provides the Steelers with. And so I'm going to switch my screen over now. Here we go. Let's get it going. All right. So Kendrick Green. Now, I'm going to use PFF because the reason why I'm going to use PFF is they actually decipher how many sacks and offensive and pressures and quarterback hits an offensive lineman allows. Now, I don't always love PFF, but it is important to just have a look at those. Now, a lot of the jury right now in the Steelers fan community is Kendrick Green's never going to cut it as a center. That may be the case, but he was taken in the 3rd round. He did start a year at center when he probably shouldn't. He probably should have been given a year to learn how to snap the football properly. He didn't play at all in 2022. So if we go back and look at what he did in college, he only played 326 snaps at center. Now, that's probably a big concern for some people. That was because, though, they had another guy that could play center. I think Doug Kramer was his name off the top of my head. And he couldn't play guard. I think it's Doug Kramer. He definitely was out of Illinois, but there's another guy that was on the team. And so basically what that meant is that Kendrick Green, when he projected in the NFL, was a lot more of that stereotypical stature of a center. He could pull as well. That was the big thing coming out. And there's another bloke on this list that we'll talk about as well. But that was sort of the fight that you liked in it. He went and took Pouncey's number. He probably shouldn't have done that. But I don't think that affects your play on the field. Now, interestingly, only allowed 4 sacks in all of his college career, only allowed 7 quarterback hits, 30 hurries, 41 pressures. And in the years where he played center, particularly the most snaps at center with 211 in his 2020 year. Now, remember, that was a COVID year. They didn't play all games. He didn't allow any sacks, 2 hits, 4 hurries. And he did have 4 penalties, though. So Kendrick Green, there is some center experience there. Now, we did see him in the NFL for the Steelers back in 2021, where he played 975 snaps at center. He had 9 penalties, 3 sacks he allowed, 4 quarterback hits, 11 hurries, 18 pressures. Still, he had an efficiency rate according to PFF of 98.2, but his blocking grades were in the 50s. Now, even if you don't love PFF, the blocking grades being that slow is a bit of an issue. So you don't really like that. So for a lot of people, that's why Kendrick Green's on the chopping block. But in context with what we're going to talk about, is that actually the case? Just because we think that as fans, could he have developed? He's obviously got to have a big training camp, but let's look at it when we start talking through some of the other potential players that could fill in as depth at center. So the next guy you've got is Ryan McCollum. Now, Ryan McCollum was on the squad last year. He was on the practice squad. He got brought in, I think, just before the season started or in the first 4 to 6 weeks of the season, if my memory serves me correctly. Definitely there participating in OTAs. I saw him in the background. His actual locker in the change room behind Pat P in one of the, I think it was day 2 of the OTAs and Pat P's media interview. So it was either that or Sam Marlowe. Might have been Sam Marlowe. But basically, McCollum played in Detroit, was drafted by the Texans. They released him. He played 4 games in Detroit in 2021. Didn't play in 2022 for anyone, but he was on the Steelers for most of that. So I don't really want to look deeply in his NFL career because we've seen 4 games from him. But let's go back to Texas A&M. And this is the fun thing. He played there when DeMarvin Leal played there, and he was also on the same offensive line as Dan Moore Jr. So there's a fun fact for you as well. Now, he played about 1,877 snaps in college. You can see that, as these total up. He only allowed 2 sacks in his whole career, 11 quarterback hits in his whole career in college, 39 hurries, 52 pressures. At center, he had 785 snaps, 520 at left guard, 571 at right guard. So the majority of the position he played was in the center position. Played a bit more at right guard. That made sense because Dan Moore actually started into guard and moved out to tackle in his last couple of years. So it makes sense that he probably wasn't playing on the left side, at least with that from that perspective. Now, he played all of his 2020 snaps, remember again, COVID year, 628 of those at the center position. No sacks allowed, only 3 hits and 5 quarterback hurries, 8 pressures. That was his best performance, not maybe hit-wise, but in terms of pressures and allowing no sacks. He did play 628 snaps. He had offensive run blocking grades all in the 65 to 69 range. That's pretty cool from him. If we go even into his, I think this has got his 2020 year. Yeah, he played best against Auburn, probably the best apart from LSU. The best opponent they would have played that year, just going off what I recall from those records. So he stepped up for the competition. So actually, I had Ryan McCollum on the practice squad, maybe even the chopping block. He's sort of gone up. He's ticked up in my thoughts around could he be there. Now, if you look at the questions, yes, Kendrick Green has the experience, but it's a little bit of knowing, we kind of know what we've got and we don't really like it. McCollum, can he work in training camp to cement the spot as depth there? Now, again, you might sit there and go, well, hey, I'd rather not have Kendrick Green or Ryan McCollum, and I totally get it. So let's look at a guy like James Daniels, who played right guard for the Steelers last year. Now, James Daniels has not really played center in the NFL for a while. He played right guard in 2022 for the Steelers. 2021, he played it for Chicago, exclusively there. The Steelers, he played 1 left tackle, 1 left guard snap, as you can see on the screen right now in front of you. But really, he's not played at all really at the center position since 2019, where he played just under half the snaps he played in 2019 there. Now, that year he allowed 1 sack, 4 hits, 15 quarterback hurries. So interesting perspective there in that he did allow 1 of the 4 sacks he's allowed in his whole career. His hits were about on par. Hurries weren't the highest he's had. Certainly, it was less than what he had that year, than what he had last year with Pittsburgh. Pressures was the same. Now, what we can do is actually go into 2019 and we can have a look at potentially where he played the snaps and where he allowed the sack. So he played 56 snaps in that game against Oakland in 2019, and he was playing at center that week, and that's where he allowed the sack. As you see, he started out at center and switched to left guard later in the season. Now, that is where he had a lot less pressures. But he had less hurries at center if you look at that from that perspective. So it kind of, yes, and I think, a hurry is obviously a bit different to the pressure there. The sack was allowed at center. The fact he's only ever played 508 snaps at center in his career, you kind of, in the NFL, that's not going to be your solution. And you want him at guard. You don't want to move James Daniels in and cause any kerfuffle. He's had 2 years now where he's done that. He's only allowed 3 sacks in those 2 years, allowed 50 hurries combined, which is not, it could get better, but it's not the worst, and 60 of his 109 pressures. You want him to keep getting better. It was his equal best year from an efficiency rate, according to PFF. It wasn't his best ratings year. But you don't want to shift that, particularly because you've got a nice budding combination there with Chooks as well. All right, so James Daniels is probably not the answer. Kendrick Green is probably not the answer for some people. Ryan McCollum, he's the guy at the moment that's firming to be that depth. Now, whether you like it or you hate it, that's the reality. It's a practice squad guy. It's a guy that got cut after being drafted by the Texans in 2021. Played a handful of games for Detroit. They weren't that great, at least according to the PFF grades. I usually prefer Pro Football Reference, but as I mentioned, very hard to get grades and stats on Pro Football Reference other than games played and penalties. So that's one of the key things that we wanted to talk about. The other thing too is that he had 4 penalties when he was playing center there, which is, certainly not his highest, but he had 5 last year. So would that go back up? Who knows? All right. So the final guy we get to is the 7th round draft pick out of Maryland, which is Spencer Anderson. Now, Spencer Anderson's listed at guard here, played all over the line, right? So you can see right here, the only position he didn't, I'm pretty sure he played a little bit at right tackle. Yeah, he did. So he played 2,379 snaps in his college career. 819 of those were at right guard, 382 were at center, 43 at left guard, 29 at left tackle, 1,099 at right tackle. I didn't think I covered that one. Now, he played 316 snaps at center in 2021, 66 snaps the year before in 2020. I've watched 22 tape of Spencer Anderson. I was going to do a bit of a film session with you guys with the clippings of that because I want to respect other people's YouTube work. I might still do that depending on what people's reaction is in the comments around wanting to know more about Spencer Anderson. But I'll tell you what, he blew a damn good right guard in 2022. I looked at the Michigan game. I watched the Ohio State game. I watched a couple of other games 2021. All I could find, because it's very hard to find college tape, all I could find of him, none of it was at center. So the big X factor for me when we talk about the question of do the Steelers have center depth and does Spencer Anderson fit into the mix, I honestly need to see him snap the ball, in training camp to be able to determine that question. But what I will tell you is he played damn good at right guard. He went up against Michigan's Mazai Smith, who was Bruce Veltman's number 1 on the freak athletes list. He and Keanu Benton, who the Steelers selected in the 2nd round at pick 50 off the top of my head. He, after picking Joe Porter at 32, Keanu Benton and he were kind of seen as the 2 guys first to go in the 2nd round. Now, Mazai Smith actually went early. I think Mazai Smith got picked up by the Cowboys in the back of round 1. But even still, I remember Mazai Smith going before Benton. Mazai Smith got manhandled at points by Spencer Anderson. Jeffrey Benedict actually has done I did all my background for this, and I wanted to check one stat that I couldn't find. And I went to Jeffrey Benedict. I thought he might have done a film room on him, and he had. You can find that at behindthesteelcurtain.com. But Benedict talks about a lot about how Spencer Anderson's got areas to improve, but certainly, can he turn it on because he does stuff. I liked what I saw on tape. He's got movement. He can pull. I think he showed much more pull than Kendrick Green did. Look, he went in the 7th round because he didn't play a lot in college in his early years. Maryland weren't necessarily the best team. He moved all over the line, so there wasn't a set position. 2020 would have been a big year for him. Obviously, that was a COVID year. But he had a good 2021, and I thought he looked good on tape in 2022. Now, as I said, I didn't watch every Maryland game inside out, back to front, but I have done some analysis on the offense that from about 3 or 4 games, and he does show up on tape. He's always on tape. He's getting to the 2nd level. You love that. Now, when he got drafted, I went there and said to Marky D, I think he's a center prospect for the Steelers. All those 216 snaps, that's almost more than Kendrick Green had. I think this is the guy that's going to be at center. He's 6'5". He's about 310 to 320. He's going to make a really nice big center to back up Mason Cole, and he doesn't have to start right away. And then you watch the tape, and he played so well at right guard, I almost think it would be wasted. I'd rather him be a project from redshirt for a year for the Steelers, and they develop him into a really top guard, to maybe challenge James Daniel in a year or two's time. Remember, James Daniel's on a 3-year deal, off the top of my head. He's 1 year through that. Could Spencer Anderson come in and challenge him for it? Imagine that. So I actually don't see Spencer Anderson as the solution at center unless he starts to really support that at camp and start snapping the ball, and that looks good. So that only brings up one other name. If we go back to the depth chart, that only brings up one other name that I kind of feel a little bit comfortable with. Again, a guy that's not snapped the ball in a long time, and that's Isaac Seumalo, right? Now, I talked about the 4 questions they've got to answer. We've talked through 4 players. Then the only other guy I can think of on this team that really could provide a solution is comes down to Isaac Seumalo. And can he move back to center? Now, remember when he came out of if you actually go back and look at when he came out of Ohio State, Oregon State, he definitely had a projection. If you go back, you can find it on YouTube. You Google it after this show. You go back and you look at what the evaluation of him was when the pick came through. It was that would he project as a center in the NFL? That's what the scouts had said. He has only played 34 snaps at center in his whole NFL career. Never did anything else. Always played guard. And so that I think is a really interesting question for teams to have to understand. What does not teams, but for the Steelers to have to understand, can he do anything? He only had 92 snaps at center for Oregon State. So right now, if we answer the question of do the Steelers have depth at center, I don't think they've got like a guy that you'd be happy with for 4 or 5 games. They've got a guy that can come in for a series. They've got a guy that maybe can come in for a quarter. But I don't truly believe they've got a guy on the roster, unless you love Kendrick Green, that's the solution at center. So look at that as a position where the Steelers might add some guys throughout throughout camp, preseason, good games, all that bye week when they see guys cut. This center position is a work in progress. We might do a similar show on the linebackers, but I definitely want to cover this off because you've got Spencer Anderson, you've got a 7th round guy in the mix, a bit of an X factor. You've got Ryan McCollum, who we haven't seen a lot out of. If there's one guy I'd like for them to consider blooding, it is Spencer Anderson. I say he did do well at guard, but he can pull. He's athletic. I just haven't seen him spot the football, so I can't advocate for that. But I hope you're enjoying the show. If you did like the show, hit the like button. If you haven't subbed and you've listened to a few shows, consider subbing. If you're a sub, tell your friends about us as well. We'd love to bring more people into the Steelers Touchdown Under community. So as always, go Steelers.